LeighTDickey.com. Well, hello everybody, Leigh Dickey here. Welcome to another episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. Before we get into the body of today's show, which is a follow-up to last week's episode, my first ever guest interview, I want to tell you where you can find the Beats and Speaks podcast. New episodes of the Beats and Speaks podcast are released every Friday at midnight Eastern Time and are available on my official website, LeighTDickey.com, iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Remember to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Leave us a review, and I will feature it on social media and my website. If you would like to be a guest on the Beats and Speaks podcast, email me at leightdickey@gmail.com. That's LeighTDickey @gmail.com, and we will go from there. I want to hear stories from you guys, stories about who you are, how your life is, and what you are doing. So if you would like to be a guest on a future episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast, send me an email to leightdickey@gmail.com. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into the body of today's episode, of this week's episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast, a follow-up and behind-the-scenes look at my first ever guest interview with Marco Attanasi. Here we go. Yes, so a behind-the-scenes look at my first ever guest interview with Marco Attanasi. And he was a great guest. I loved having him on, and I'm happy that he had a great time from what he told me and in emails after the show. It was fantastic having him on. He was a great first guest, really open, really candid. He was just, a great guy to have on and a great guy to conversate with about absolutely everything under the sun. We talked about Pokemon, video games, the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy, his life, what it was like to be bullied, his experience with martial arts, and he was just a fantastic first guest. I can't ask for anything better than that. He was just a fantastic guy, and that's my goal with the Beats and Speaks podcast. I want to hear stories from people. I want to hear interesting stories from interesting people like yourselves. And the behind the scenes stuff with him, it was rather easy just to get him booked. It was like, I'd like to, he sent me an email after I put out a call to, finding guests, that I was looking for guests to come on the show, because I had finally found out a way how to record remote interviews. I actually was thinking, I would do more in-person interviews, but my first interview with Marco Attanasi, my first guest interview ever, was a remote interview. I was sitting at a Starbucks at a coffee shop, and he was sitting at a gym, and we just knocked out about a half an hour interview that way. I think there was about 25 minutes of us actually talking, and then a couple minutes each of the intro and the extra for me, but it was about a half an hour. I talked to him for maybe half hour, 45 minutes in general, and we were just going back and forth. It was great. So the setup for this whole thing, other than, getting him to come on the show as my first guest, and I told him that just before we, hit record and you guys got the interview that you got last week, I was sitting at Starbucks, and leading up to the show, or leading up to the interview, I was trying to figure out, because I'd never done a remote interview before. The last sort of interview I had done was as part of a radio station when I worked there, that was maybe, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe even a little longer than that. So I hadn't done an interview in a very long time, as I haven't been an interviewer in a long time. That's what I mean. But with this, I was just like, I want to get other people on the show. And Marco was gracious enough to be the first guest, and I loved having him on. He was just a fantastic guy to have on. It was a fantastic story, how he dealt with bullies, and his experience with martial arts, and what it was like growing up in the 90s and being an only child with a single mom and what have you. It was great. In terms of the behind the scenes for me, the technical aspect of this interview was a bit of a challenge. I recorded it with Zoom, the video conferencing software that is available for everybody to use, and that's how we did the interview. He actually suggested it because he'd said that he was available. We recorded it, I think, on the 8th, and I released it on the 13th, so last Friday. And so he had said that he was available on that day, and I said, okay, fine, no problem. Because it was my first interview, I was just, trying to figure out something that would work. And I'd never done a remote interview. I had tried to use Skype in years previous, but it was just, it was the learning curve and the signal chain, it was a little difficult for me. So I figured, okay, let's try and figure out how Zoom works and how to use it to record a podcast or an interview between two people or more. I think with the free version of it, you get to do an interview with two people, no problem. And that's what we did. So I set that whole thing up, even though I didn't realize that you needed to actually download a piece of software. And then I set that up on an old netbook that I have, and it still works, thankfully. So, and it still runs. So, I set all that up. I was sitting at a table, and I was just trying to figure out how it would work. I hit record there, it saves locally, or you can save it to the cloud if you want. I chose to save it locally and then just drop it through, put it into Dropbox and just have it on my main laptop, which is like an editing machine, and therefore I can just pull from Dropbox and then, convert it if I need to and go through the editing process that way, which is exactly what I did. And it was, after the setup process, getting there was a bit of an issue because I couldn't find an outlet, and the battery life on that netbook that I have isn't the greatest. It could say that you have 3.5 hours worth of power left and then just die on you and completely shut off, which is exactly what it did after about an hour of use. So I found an outlet. Thankfully, I had my the plug and the charger with me. So found an outlet, got set up, and basically just waited on Marco. I think we had originally scheduled for 6, but due to the technical errors the technical issues on my part, I finally got set up about 6:15. We set again 6:30, and then he was running late, which is through no fault of his own. It's fine, because I had hiccups and he was running behind. So it was just this, it was this new sort of fangled, I don't want to call it a leviathan, but it was this new sort of mountain that I had to climb, and I had to figure out how it actually all worked. And I'm glad I did. It was kind of funny because the rig that I usually record my podcast with when I'm on the go, I'm on the road. I'm actually recording this in a park right now with an Apex 850 dynamic microphone attached to an XLR cable that terminates into a 3.5 millimeter jack. It's going into my cell phone right now, into my smartphone, and that's how I'm recording this. And this is exactly how I recorded. Well, not exactly. It's to an extent. I have the mic on a desktop stand, and I'm maybe a foot away, so I'm sitting in a park right now, and that's how I'm recording this one, and it's mainly how I recorded the interview with Marco. The only difference is I had this same mic, the Apex 850, with an XLR cable on this same stand, but the XLR cable terminated into a USB connection, which would just make it easier on everybody. It was one of those things I probably could have used the 3.5 millimeter cable and connection because the netbook had that capability, but I was like, you know what, let's just plug the USB thing in. And the audio quality, it's fine, it's great for what it was. It's fantastic. Marco was in a gym, I was sitting in a cafe at the time. He was a fantastic first guest, but that the technical aspect of it, when it came to setting everything up on my end, when downloading the software, figuring out how Zoom worked, and it's simple enough to use, and then having my netbook die basically and just shut off on me, and finding an outlet, and then setting up the microphone and getting all the drivers installed. It was I was like, all this for my guests. I'm like, listen, it's fine. I wanted to start getting guests on this show. Let's just go for it, have at it, and just it'll be fine. It'll be great. People will love it because it's not just you, Leigh, talking into a microphone for 10, 15, 20 minutes or maybe even longer, telling the story or trying to tell the story of how it went. Even though I'm enjoying telling you guys solo stories, getting someone else on here to go back and forth with and talk to is my main goal. I want to get as many guests on here and as many people on here as I possibly can, just because I want to hear their stories. I want to hear stories from people who have different perspectives and have lived a different life and have just experienced different things. And I think that would make for a fantastic podcast. I don't know. And you guys tell me. I want to get as many people on here that have as many different stories and they all come from many different backgrounds. But, that the technical setup for me, when it came to recording that interview with Marco wasn't the issue. It was just the hardware and the software and the whole setup thing, because I was sitting at a Starbucks, I was sitting at a coffee shop just trying to get this all done and recorded and have something that you guys could use, because I was right up against the gun when it came to like editing that thing. And I figure, like, if I don't want to do a solo show, if I don't want to record, or if I'm not feeling it that week, we'll throw a guest interview up, and then I'll give you guys the behind the scenes aspect on it from my perspective, as is the case here with this first interview. There's no issue on Marco's part. It was just a whole bunch of technical snafus on my part, because I had never done a remote interview before. I'd never used Zoom before. I mean, like, I'd used Zoom before when it came to being a guest on someone's podcast. I've been the interviewee. I've never been the interviewer and then had to use Zoom to record. So thankfully there's enough material on YouTube that I could pull from and figure out how it worked. And thankfully there are people out there smarter than me that know how this stuff works and have experience with it. I could probably set up a recording rig, no problem, but when it came to doing remote interviews with a piece of software that I've never used before, the internet is your best resource at this point. Google is your friend. YouTube is, your best man, basically. It's the best thing. And that's basically how I figured out how to work Zoom when it came to recording a remote interview with a guest in a different location. And I loved having Marco on. Like I said, he's a fantastic guy. He had a great story. And I really couldn't have asked for a better first guest. So he was fantastic. And, reading his email I think I got it yesterday, where he enjoyed his time. And that's what I want to do with future guests that I have on the show. I want to make them as comfortable as possible, like mi casa, su casa. So, I want to hear their stories. I want to reach out to as many people as possible, and I want to have as many interviews on this show as possible, because, you might love the sound of my voice. I know I don't, but you guys might like it. You might love the 15, 20 minutes it takes me to, spit out a story and give you guys a new episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. But I think you'll like it even better, and you'll like it even more if I can get someone on here, if I can get a guest on the show to tell you about themselves and tell you about interesting stories that happened to them. And I think it would just make the show better. It would make, it would give me, I don't want to call it a break, but it would give me sort of a reprieve. Therefore, I don't have to talk as much. Therefore, I don't have to flap my gums as much. Even though I really enjoy doing the show, it gives me a bit of a breather, which I think is paramount in every aspect of life. Like, you need some sort of a buffer. You need a break at points. So having a guest on here and having them tell me their story, and then, a guest interview to me is almost like a vacation, I suppose, because I don't have to pull from my bag of tricks and tell you guys a story by myself. even though I enjoy doing that, and I did that for the first 34 episodes. So I'm gonna, it'll be a mix of me doing solo shows. It'll be a mix of me, having guests on the show, and I do have some more guests like in the works. They're in the books and they're coming in, which is great. I'm in the process of getting as many guests as I possibly can. If you guys know of anybody that just wants to tell their story and have great conversation, general interest, tell the world about themselves, and they're comfortable doing an interview, hit me up at leightdickey@gmail.com. If you want to be a guest yourself, contact me in the exact very same way, and we'll just, shoot the breeze, have a very like-minded, smooth conversation, and just chill out, be two people on a podcast, just telling stories and talking about interesting things in our lives and things that have happened to us and our experiences, and talk about, we'll talk anything, pop culture, mystery. You can tell me about your favorite podcast. I mean, that would be fantastic. I will talk to anybody who has a story, anybody that wants to talk, anybody that wants to have a conversation. But that right there is basically the gist of the behind-the-scenes look at my first ever guest interview with Marco Attanasi. He was a great first guest, had a fantastic story, and all that it was some technical issues on my end, where my netbook died, and it was just getting Zoom to agree with my netbook and having all the inputs go to the same place, and having just no issues whatsoever when it came to, like, I set the mic up right, I've set the software up right, I can hear Marco, he can hear me, and it just, I think it took the better part of 2.5 hours for me to figure all that out as I was sitting and going back and forth between an outlet and where I was initially sitting, which was at a long table that didn't have any plugs. So after, doing all that for probably a couple hours and then setting everything up finally and getting this interview off the ground, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, because the last thing I want to do is disappoint anybody, and I don't want to have to say, look, I have to back out of the interview, because I don't want to do that. These guys are my guests. I value their time as much as I value mine, so I'm very appreciative that Marco was my first guest and that he came on. I'm appreciative of everybody that listens to this show. I'm appreciative of any future guest that I have, or anybody that wants to reach out to me, whether you're a fan or you want to come on the show, or you have friends that want to listen to this show and they want to tell their story. I'm all for it. So if you want to be a guest, if you have friends that want to be a guest, if you know people that are looking to get some promotion and want to just have a conversation with a pretty relaxed, laid-back guy who just wants the same, then email me at leightdickey, that's LEIGHTDICKEY @gmail.com. You can find the Beats and Speaks podcast on your favorite podcast platform, so iTunes, Spotify, and everywhere else. My official website, leightdickey.com, as well. Write and leave us a review. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. But that's it for this week's episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, please comment, like, share, and subscribe. Leave us a review. New episodes of the Beats and Speaks podcast are released every Friday at midnight Eastern Time on my official website, leightdickey.com, iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find the Beats and Speaks podcast and me on YouTube by searching and subscribing to Leigh Dickey TV. That's LEIGHDICKEY TV. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you all next Friday with a new episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. They go live every Friday at midnight Eastern Time on leightdickey.com and your podcast app and player of choice. Thanks again. We'll talk to you soon. All right. Till next week, Leigh Dickey signing off. Peace. Tenebro-Dickey.com.